Thanks for joining me for this session. Today, I'm going to be talking about what is a sketch. So, just some perspectives and uh, thoughts on the nature of a sketch, what that is, what that's all about. Like Daniela said, I'm Spencer. Most people probably know me for the sketch stuff I do, which is totally fine. But I am a professional industrial designer. Creative troublemaker is what I like to say, in that I'm always up to something. I'm always making something, doing something, working with clients, trying to learn new perspectives and points of view about my own creative process, as well as my perspective on design. So, as Daniela mentioned, I've worked with a variety of brands, make my own products as well, um, visualize, conceptualize things in 3D, sketching, and so on. So, just a few older projects there. And yeah, product design is awesome. Okay. So, what is a sketch? All right. What is a sketch? I've been drawing for about, oh man, ever since I was a kid, really. I was exposed to art at an early age by my father. He would paint in the evenings, on the veranda in our house. I grew up in Jamaica. And so I was always inspired by his craft. And additionally, my brother was an avid comic book collector. I love to collect Marvel comic books. And so I would kind of sneak and read through his comic books. He hated that, but I was always enthralled and interested by artistic expression. Right. So sketching has always been, I think, a part of how I think, how I communicate. In fact, prior to becoming a designer, I was a math major in college. I wanted to be a math teacher. And as I was studying mathematics, I would oftentimes visualize those problems with little scribbles, little sketches, little doodles, right? So when I think of a sketch, what I really think about is quick, low effort visual communication. That's one way I like to think of it. And this is perhaps the most concise way, that I can encapsulate the different means of expressing a visual idea. A sketch doesn't have to necessarily be something on paper, but if you were to look up the definition of sketching, you might find something like this: a rough or unfinished drawing or painting, often made to assist in making a more finished picture. And I think for product designers, you can see that maybe a more apt definition would be a rough or unfinished thought made to assist in making a more finished creation. Okay. Because there are different ways to express ideas. For me, my go to has oftentimes been pen on paper. Okay. Pen, paper, markers, that kind of thing. And that's because for me, it was at the time the most accessible means of communicating my ideas. So this is a sketch. I think this one's maybe 13 years old now. Very, very old sketch. And speaking of old, humans have been drawing for a very, very, very long time. Um, if you search or look up early visual communication by humans, you'll find that tens of thousands of years ago, humans attempted to visually express thoughts, concepts, ideas. Certainly, we don't know exactly what the meaning of this was, but it was, I think, indicative of this internal drive to leave their mark behind or express something visually. Like, sure, you can say something with words, you can uh, make sounds to communicate, right? But to have this visual piece is, I think, indicative of that internal drive to show something visual. And what's cool about this is it's actually been left behind and preserved long enough that we can now enjoy it. And I think that's one of the magical, cool things about visual communication expression, is it can outlast us even. And moving through history, this creative expression has evolved. Right, and that's going to be a recurring theme today, that the means, the methods, the materials through which we express ideas and concepts has evolved. This is actually a petroglyph, from here in Utah, actually, that dates back a few thousand years. So, again, really cool to see that these visual expressions and ideas, and eventually pictographic languages even, um, kind of form the foundation of the potential for narrative storytelling as we communicate ideas. And through the ages, that became more evolved as we, and this is from the Middle Ages, I believe, see more of a push to expression and realism in that visual communication as tools improved. Okay, as tools got better and so forth. And moving into product design, we see the need to express ideas that are functional, or ideas that are meaningful and relevant to humans. And again, as the tools improved, so does the expression. And we can see even more recently, right? We have images like this, where I think for myself going through college, or even being in high school drawing, had I seen something like this, it would have blown my mind because, wow, is this really a sketch? Right. So, what is a sketch after all? But as I mentioned, a big part of sketching is really narrative visual storytelling. Much like the petroglyph or the cave paintings, you can kind of suss out and see that there's somewhat of a sequential progressive narrative that is expressed visually. Okay. And I think in essence that is the function of a sketch, along with other things. But it's this narrative visual storytelling where I have an idea, I have a concept, I have a feeling, and I want to have you come along with me on that journey and experience what I'm perceiving or feeling or thinking. And that gives me an opportunity to experience someone else's unique perspective when they share this sketch. Again, traditionally more of a drawing. And as these tools evolved, so did the process of sketching and our ability to share our unique perspective, our individuality, because sketches executed or was executed by hand traditionally. There is by circumstance a part of us in that drawing, a part of us in that sketch. The other cool thing about people, humans, is we seek to create order and solutions to problems, right? If we need to transport something from point A to point B, we come up with a means of doing that. Maybe it's a wheel, maybe it's a sled, right? Maybe it's a backpack. Whatever the case may be, depending on the need, we seek to create order from chaos, from disorder. Um, think about manufacturing for those of you who are product designers, industrial designers, and how raw materials are sourced, and those raw materials are processed and eventually become the products that we use. Between the thoughts that we have and the things that we use, there is that sketch, that uh, creative thought that is the output of quick, low effort visual communication. Traditionally, however, sketches, if you think about it, so think about these primitive humans, or uh, older humans, right? That came before us. What tools were they using, right? What tools were they using? How did they get their pigments? How did they get those implements? Oftentimes, those materials, those tools were sourced, right, from nature. And so traditional sketches, like if you go way back, they would have taken a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of skills, material, maybe even thought, mental effort to complete those sketches. Right. And I think within the visual communication space, illustration design, so forth, there's oftentimes a certain admiration given to a sketch or drawing that took, hours. It's like, wow, this is good because it took time, right? And I think that comes with the territory with regards to sketching. Um, but visual communication is a reliably powerful medium of expression and communication because you can pack a lot into a single drawing. You can pack a lot of different thoughts into a single drawing. And effectively, a sketch is really just part of a conversation that you might be having with someone else or that you might be having with yourself. And what I mean is, at least for me, if I conceptualize something, if it's usually like a fuzzy thought in my head. I may not know all the details up front. I may not be bringing a finished idea to the table. And so this process of sketching And communication is really just a matter of validating the thought or idea that I have. And it's certainly an iterative process, something that by necessity takes time, maybe multiple versions, and it's a comparative exercise with that concept that we may be thinking of, or maybe it's a grouping of concepts, right, that are themed and related to each other. Sometimes is sometimes sketching takes place later in the process, right? While you're prototyping, you're making something and you're not really quite sure how it's going to turn out. Um, okay, someone said no audio is coming through, so I just want to make sure we're good here. Y'all can hear me, right? Okay, awesome. So sometimes it's something that takes place later in the process where you are prototyping, you are working on something that is tangible. And this is where a quick, low effort visual expression can help validate your thinking along the way. Right. I'm not having to spend a tremendous amount of time, money, or effort to think about the iterations of that idea until ultimately you do have that finished product, that finished expression, right? And it feels good, frankly, when you sketch something out and then you make it and it looks the way you felt, which maybe sounds weird, but I do feel like a lot of design can be this uh, very emotional thing, as much as these early humans were likely expressing something that was visceral, emotional from within. So another thing with sketching I like to or I've contemplated over the years is oftentimes as a designer, as or anyone who's conceptualizing something, you're sketching something from your imagination, right? Maybe it doesn't exist, or maybe you have an idea about two products that, hey, what if these two products had a baby? What does that look like? Um, you're kind of working from your imagination. At the same time, there's an opportunity to sketch from observation. Why does that matter? Well, if you think about a sketch as communication, okay, it's about representing reality in a reliably familiar way. So things like perspective drawing, if you're going to hang out and be in the subsequent session, I'll be doing a little workshop. We'll talk about perspective, right? And being able to draw perspective or communicate perspective in a two-dimensional medium, as I have in traditional sketching, is really just about presenting things in a familiar way. And even though you are presenting things in a familiar way, and there's this kind of tug and pull between imagination and observation, this balance, if you will, a sketch is really just an abstraction of reality in a way. Meaning, traditionally, if I'm sketching on paper or even a tablet, Gravity Sketch kind of changes the game a bit there in terms of quick, low effort visual communication, but there isn't necessarily a depth to that presentation, right? It's just a 2D medium. So you have to rely on those um, relatable traits that you might see in perspective to communicate that idea a bit better. So here's a few examples of work that I've done to kind of hone that skill, because again, I want to be aware, I want to be familiar with how things kind of look so that I can be a better imaginative sketcher and communicator as I'm sharing concepts. So, in addition to being a conversation, or maybe I didn't mention that yet. Oh, I did. Okay. In addition to being a conversation, a sketch is a contemplation, right? I might be asking, what if, like I said, what if these two products had a baby together? Or what if the product was shaped a certain way? Or what if the function was um, in line with a conversation I had with an engineer? What does that look like? And so, oftentimes with industrial design, anyways, we lay out our concepts in a way that goes back to this idea of narrative storytelling. There's almost a timeline of thought that is inherent to a sketch page when we create something, right? So as I've thought about this process over the years, why is this not? Skipping here. Oh, there we go. So as I've thought about this process over the years, it's kind of like this. All right, we start with imagining something in your head. As I mentioned, it might be a fuzzy picture. We execute, so we draw something. Maybe you feel good about it. Maybe you second guess yourself and you want to throw your drawing away. But if not, then you can refine. Pardon me. And to refine, we visually evaluate what happened, compare that with the mental picture we may have had, and continue to execute, right? So it's kind of this cycle, if you will, in activity. So first step in sketching, I think, is to imagine. So ideas begin in your head, right? Our the potential for an idea is immense if it's conceptualized in our heads because there are no limitations really. Um, Save it be our experience or inspiration, whatever knowledge we're working with. We can dream as big as we want or as small as we want. So imagine that idea. Like as I mentioned, for me, there's usually a fuzzy, fleeting thought, sometimes an emotional thing. I really feel like, if you've ever been drawing and you've had thoughts like that, right? I feel like this would be great, or um, I want to convey the feeling of, and maybe you pick an adjective, speed. What does that look like? And you start sketching until your feeling matches what your imagination is. So in this case, if I were sketching something like a shoe, maybe I would start with that feeling, that rough doodle, like real quick. All right, I'm thinking something like this. And then we start executing, right? So whether it's pen on paper or it's clay or foam or whatever, I still consider those sketches because again, it's about quick, low effort visual communication. That could be tangible, that could be just a 2D drawing or 3D. Make it real, right? Do something, make it real, and then you can kind of evaluate what you've done and compare with that initial thought, that initial idea. All right. So as you execute, maybe you create some refinements. Okay, this is how I think the line should go. This is the shape. All right. And you continue to refine as well by being aware of what you've done, pivoting if you need to, constantly comparing that mental image that you may have conceptualized initially against the work that you've done. Okay. So it's important as you sketch to really be conscious and thoughtful, I think, as a creator. And this will relate to a later topic in the presentation, but it's important to be mindful of what you're doing so that you can get the output that you actually want. All right. And as you refine, you may add colors, textures, and so forth. And again, as a means of communicating things like colors and textures, perspective, and so forth will make the idea more relatable to someone, right? And the thing with sketching though is it can be as it can be high fidelity, meaning super detailed, super clean, super precise, or it might be something like I love Frank Gehry's sketches of his architecture concepts because you can just tell he is, at least I can tell. I'm making some assumptions and inferences here that he's operating from a place of emotion and gesture and feeling, right? Just creating these crazy architectural concepts that then his team had to figure out, I'm sure. Or in my case, sometimes it's something that you do in the middle of a project, like I mentioned, and as a means of narrative storytelling about design intent, right? Especially if you're working with people who, or in situations where there may be language barriers or maybe a gap in understanding in each other's expertise. Think of designers working with engineers. Sometimes it's easier to just visually sketch something and say, I think it kind of works like this. How can we make this work, right? As opposed to merely speaking about the idea or concept. So again, thinking about the evolution of visual communication and expression in sketching, it really took knowledge of creating your own materials. Think about those cave paintings, the cave rocks, right? Where humans marked the rocks. What did they mark it with? Maybe it was some pigment that they sourced. Or think of tempera painting, where artists would make their own paints using eggs and pigments that they sourced, right? That took a lot of work. And as technology evolved, so did our ability to work more quickly. Okay. And there's a progression there. Um, all of these tools that I'm going to show you here can apply color and mimic texture or define shapes. The difference really, I think, comes down to speed and nature of expression related to sketching. So whether you're using a marker or colored pencil, you can still apply color, but how that color appears on the paper may seem different. I could work with ink, and I could paint with that ink as well, right? But maybe I'm limited in my ability to express colors a certain way. I can work with pens as well, or work digitally, right? Just because I'm drawing on a screen, does that make it less valuable than drawing on paper or painting on an actual canvas, right? Where and how, and this is just a rhetorical question. I don't expect you all to answer necessarily, but where does our valuing of that activity lie? Is it the time, the skill, the effort involved, right? Because again, as the tools get better, we get better. I'm not a classically trained artist or painter in the sense that, I didn't take fine art classes, but I love painting and I love the ability that digital products have given us to expand what we can actually do. And this I wouldn't consider this a sketch, but just merely to show that the tools are evolving. Okay. And I think this is Danielle. I just grabbed this from Google. But again, Gravity Sketch being an evolution in that in our ability to express our ideas in a certain way and to play in certain spaces that just weren't possible before. And tools are still evolving. Really exciting times ahead. Drawing is the artist's most direct and spontaneous expression. A species of writing, it reveals better than does painting their true personality. And I like that quote because it again touches on this idea of emotion in sketching and visual communication. One of my I I'll touch on this a little bit later as well, but one of my hesitations in my career was really embracing digital sketching, and to some extent I'm still a traditionalist in some ways. But it wasn't an aversion to the tool so much as it was I felt a distancing of myself from being able to express myself in a way that was authentically me. Okay. That may sound weird, but even when I'm using a tool like Procreate or Adobe Fresco or Photoshop, I try to create my own brushes because I want my sketch to have my emotion, my feeling, and my type of expression. All right. So, with this evolution, our capacity for creation is just rapidly expanding. The last few years have been, frankly, just wild, absolutely wild. We've seen technology augmenting our ability to communicate ideas and concepts. Like I said, even something as simple, I know the iPad's 10 years old now, but it seems as though these leaps in or tools and what these tools can do are orders of magnitude greater than previous iterations. Okay. So when I was in college, for example, we would draw on Wacom tablets without screens, which for some of the younger participants here may sound really weird, using an Intuos tablet, for example, but that's how I started. And eventually the technology came out where you could actually draw on a screen. That was mind blowing. Like, wow, I have an art studio at my desktop because I didn't have a laptop then. That was really cool. And then fast forward to what would they be? What would that be? 2012, 2011. Um, we start seeing Apple entering this space. And I'm not saying Apple was the first or the only participant in this space, but I think the iPad was kind of a moment where the technology became much more accessible. And then Procreate showed up, and it's been an interesting ride. So there's all these iterations that are happening with our technology. I think, in fact, I don't use these tools very often, but and I think that goes back to my core principle of wanting to do things the hard way sometimes. But even in an app like Procreate, where you can draw on the screen and the app will kind of help you draw an ellipse. Ellipses are really hard to draw, or it'll help you draw straight lines, or it'll help you smooth out your stroke while you're drawing, for example. So when I'm sketching, I always think about, okay, what are the means, the method, and what is the meaning I'm trying to communicate, right? Always at the forefront of my mind, something that I'm thinking of. How am I going to do this? What's the best tool to express the idea? It's not about, hey, I'm just a ballpoint pen person, and that's all I'm going to do. It's what's the best means? How am I going to do this? And what's the meaning I'm trying to convey? Because ultimately, that is, I think, the purpose of the sketch. Again, this idea of narrative storytelling, but also I want to make sure that what I'm doing is the most efficient, lean, quick way to express that idea. All right. Sketching does take a lot of effort, though. It takes a lot of practice because what you're actually dealing with is, I think, if you think about like competition and being good at something with sketching, you're really competing against yourself in some ways, where knowing that there's a lot of practice that has to go into it, the quality of your sketch is going to be dependent on your ability to understand perspective drawing, for example, conceptually, or depth perception, and how to use things like line weights or colors to communicate that depth, right? There's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge that comes with that. And so for a lot of people, it can be really intimidating to jump into sketching. And one thing I neglected to mention is as these tools have evolved, right? I no longer have to go source materials from nature and make my own paints or pigments to create this piece of art. So now it becomes more accessible because I can make an exchange of cash for some material. I can buy the paint instead of having to go make the paint, or instead of having to just use pastel or chalk, I can now use a marker. I can use an airbrush, right? So that changes my ability to express and the speed at which I express those ideas. Keep losing my mouse here. Sorry. So the craziest thing I've seen so far in my career are these generative ideation tools. All right. I'm not 100% sure if Jordan gave his talk already from viscom.ai, but um, awesome product. I don't know if hopefully you've checked it out. Highly recommended. But interesting tool in that it's a tool that I think leapfrogs and certainly pushes our ability to communicate even further. So someone like myself, I have the skill, the expertise to communicate an idea, decided to play with Viscom. And this is before they had the text prompt tool. Decided to play with it. What is this all about? Can I do something with a line sketch and have it render it? And I wanted to compare my process that I used to color the sketch in something like Photoshop with Viscom. And while I didn't color the Viscom sketch, I was completely blown away at the time by how quick and easy it was to take my simple line drawing of a sketch and add those shades, those values, and make something three-dimensional. Okay, Viscom talk is tomorrow. Thank you. Um, but I was just blown away at how quickly rather, I was able to create some depth, right, and some body to this sketch. I didn't have to necessarily um, know how to do it myself because the program was there to help. And the potential for this at the time, this was about a year ago, it was just mind blowing, right? And we've seen some evolutions. I won't say too much about what Viscom is doing. I'll let them do that. But here we have an example of their text input AI augmented sketch process. And I say that in the sense that a sketch is, again, about quick, low effort, visual expression and communication. And as you can see on the left side of the screen here, what Viscom can do now is take a very loose idea or concept that we create as designers, creatives. It does still require some skill, still requires a sense of what you want to get, but being augmented by this technology means that, well, hey, now I can put together a concept that visually is impressive, but also what's interesting is these engines, these generative tools will sometimes give us results that we don't expect ourselves, right? More on that in a little bit later, but really interesting. Here's another example of output from Viscom, and this one broke my brain. I remember when Jordan posted this on the Instagram, and I was like, "What? How?" Like, if you look at the okay, so on the bottom of each of these images is the input, right? Someone like me, I've sketched automotive interiors. I can do it, no problem. It takes time. It takes an understanding of perspective, right? But here you can see how this AI influence tool. I'm not. It's because it's not a pure AI tool in the sense that you are providing some input. A human is still a part of this process, right? You're drawing. You're in the app. You're doing this, but with the aid of the AI technology that's a part of this app, uh, uh, you can see how it will level up what we can do as humans. All right. And when I saw this one, like I said, it broke my brain because my reflexive reaction was, "Oh no, here it comes." Right. Um all this effort and time that I've put into uh, being a good sketcher, being a good visual communicator would like, what? Right? It's pretty impressive. Now, if you pay close attention to the images, you'll notice that they're not perfect, right? They're not perfect. But think about time for the time that you put into something like this and what you get out. Okay. Pretty incredible. Just a few seconds, and that's what you get. So Viscom.ai is one of those generative creation tools, but there's also this whole other suite of AI art and AI tools. Okay, Midjourney, DALI, and I think Stable Diffusion is another one as well. And you can read about these online. I'm not going to get into the technical underpinnings so much as just talk about the potential here, right? The evolution of our ability to express ideas is rapidly increasing. And I think there are very exciting times ahead. It's not a time to necessarily fear for the future, but to embrace the future. So this image was actually a painting that was created by Midjourney. And this painting, while very impressive, I would still consider it to be a sketch. And the reason for that is, again, if you think about the definition, at least that I presented to you, of low effort, right? Visual output, evocative of some idea or some expression. It requires human input. I have to tell these AI platforms and programs what it is I intend, right? But with that comes a certain degree of, I think, by necessity, flexibility, where I have to say, okay, hands off the wheel, somewhat. I'm going to give you some information. Give me the output, right? And so what'll happen is you type something into these apps, and then it gives you some options, and you get to decide, right? So we'll put a pin in that thought for now. But this painting won an art competition, and it was very controversial because then the question and conversation is around, okay, well, if all I'm doing is typing text into a platform or feeding this AI neural network, machine learning. I'm not even sure if it's machine learning, but if I'm just putting images in or text, am I actually doing any work? Right? Am I actually doing any work? And if I'm not doing work, does that mean that it's less valuable? Right? I think it's an interesting um, place to be and interesting question to ask. I was at the International Design Conference in Seattle, and one of my friends, Michael DeTulo, and Hector Silva and myself were talking, and we were talking about these tools. And Michael said something that really stuck with me, and that's AI is just another tool, like a marker, like a pencil, like an airbrush, like a ruler. Okay. If you don't embrace tools, you're just making life harder for yourself. So why not embrace the tool? Figure out a way to incorporate that into your process, and that's what I've been trying to do lately. But it's really wild what these tools can do. Here's one example. Is this going to work? Let's see. One example of DALI 2, where it can actually create additional background elements or expand the canvas, right? Because it understands perhaps the work of this artist. It understands a certain set of inputs, and it can expand what was previously there. It's kind of mind-blowing. So it is an interesting question. Does it make the work less valuable? Or is it just another tool, like I said, right? Something worth contemplating. Um, this is not going to work for me, is it? Okay. Hold, please. Boom. Okay. Sorry, I had to do this workaround for technical reasons. So here's another example of where an AI tool looked at the work of, say, Vincent van Gogh, and with some input, perhaps a photo or some text, it created something in a similar style. Pretty mind-blowing, right? So, as I said, these tools still require some input and some direction of some sort. My sister sent me this meme. I thought it was hilarious, so I thought I'd share it with you. So don't panic. It reads, "Everyone, AI will make designers obsolete." And the caption is AI accepting the job. I thought it was hilarious. So sometimes things go sideways, right? Which is why I say they're still going to require some input moving forward. And whereas as an illustrator, designer, visual communicator, I was functioning in the role of creator, we're going to see a shift to us as designers, illustrators, um, artists moving into the role of curator. All right. So we'll get into what this means. So the way I see it or think about it, when I'm designing a product, when I'm thinking about um, a concept, right? There's a timeline, if you will, or a big chunk of time that requires experience to come up with something worthwhile. So, for those who are more experienced, for example, think of when you were a junior designer and how many sketches or how many iterations, how many prototypes, how many things did you have to do to get to that solution, as opposed to having more experience and knowing maybe it's what's possible or knowing what's trending or whatever. It's a lot easier. I'm not saying we're perfect the older you get, but it's a lot easier the more experience you have. Either way, takes a big chunk of time, right? And you have this experience, maybe you show it to your creative director or whoever is running the project, senior designer, and they provide their eye and direction and kind of help filter your output. Okay. So, me as the sketch guy, as a junior designer, I would just sketch and sketch and sketch, right? And I'm trying to learn from my creative director. Okay, what's good here? What's the expectation, and so forth. So moving forward, as we shift the or offload rather the process of idea generation or sketching to these systems and augment our process with these technologies, what I think is going to happen is that this process of creation will take much less time and effort in the sense that I'm not having to use any sort of intense technical skill or ability to create what I'm creating. Um, and what's going to be important is fine tuning that input. You're going to get a diverse um, idea set that'll be generated. And we're going to have to acquire new skills. Like, how do I train my AI? How do I figure out the right phrasing to get what I want? So it's a different thought process. Whereas when I'm sketching, I'm not thinking to myself, what's the right way to say this? Right. I because I'm not having to necessarily say it to anyone, but rather create and then show. And so the process of of refinement is going to become more important because we're going to have so many ideas, so many concepts that are generated in a matter of seconds. You can type into these systems and have them run and have hundreds of ideas, right? That would have taken you maybe even weeks to complete at a level, even visually speaking. That is incredibly impressive. Think back to that Viscom AI example. So, what's next? What's next? We talked a little bit about the past of sketching, kind of how I do it now, and thoughts around that, and some things that are happening right now, right, with those AI tools. As I mentioned at the beginning, I used to be a hardcore traditionalist when it came to ideation, so much so that I and I still hold on to this one, as silly as it is, but I hesitate using even tools like ellipse guides and templates and perspective aids and so forth because I feel like it's important, especially if you're going to participate in this process of curation and refinement, to have a reasonable degree of skill and ability to understand what looks good, but also to then, oh yeah, I forgot to call that out, directly manipulate the output as opposed to merely telling someone else to manipulate it. Okay. So I think skills will still be important, visual communication skills. I enjoy playing chess in my spare time, and don't worry, this is relevant. So I play on my phone. I do chess puzzles, keep my brain sharp, whatnot. And this is Gary Kasparov in 1997. That was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years, 30 something. Anyhow, he was playing chess. He was the world champion chess player, meaning the best in the world, and they put him up against a machine called Deep Blue. And he played this machine and he lost. And it was a big deal because up until this point, a computer hadn't beaten a human. And how these computer systems work with chess is well, there's two approaches. This machine in particular was called, it would brute force, right? And meaning it would merely look at all permutations of every move on the chessboard and figure out what the most advantageous was, as opposed to thinking creatively like a human would. So machines and humans think a little bit differently when it comes to chess. There's a new engine out called Alpha Zero. And this one's interesting. It was created by Google. It's a neural network AI system. Trust me, this is all related. And what they did is they just gave it the game of chess, they gave it rules, and they let it run. Okay. And at first, the early games were just like, what is this? This is ridiculous. Until I don't remember how many games in, it starts to figure out, okay, here's the strategies and tactics that will win. It's really fascinating stuff. It's not so much that it is sentient in any way, but touching on notes of creativity, revealing aspects of the game that people hadn't even thought of before or conceptualized as being reasonable. All right. So for any of you who play chess, moving your pawn, like a pawn to h5 or pawn to h4 would be like insane. Like, why would you do that? But humans are starting to learn from these systems and become better at chess. So Gary Kasparov, the former chess champion who lost to Deep Blue, argued that Alpha Zero doesn't play chess in a way that reflects the presumably systematic priorities and prejudices of programmers. Instead, even though it searches for far fewer positions per move than a traditional engine, it plays in an open, aggressive style and seems to think in terms of strategy than tactics, right? Which is what I was kind of talking about. So, going back to this sketch process, whereas as humans, we conceptualize something and we execute and then we try and refine, we're thinking in a limited knowledge set, so to speak, right? Just like with chess, chess is being played for hundreds of years. These systems are going to expand our ability to consider solutions, things, ideas that we hadn't even considered before, right? You can see it in the Viscom examples where even in that shoe that I'd put up, there were shapes and things that I wouldn't even necessarily think of. So it's going to change the way that we express ideas and the possibility of what we express even. So we're going to continue to see the integration of these generative capabilities in workflows and experiences that we may be already familiar with. If you haven't yet, take some time, play with the neural filters in Adobe Photoshop, for example. Right, that's just one example. They are working actively now on incorporating AI tools into the creative process. Okay, And there is some concern about that, but at the same time, I think what makes it a little bit different is how much control we have as visual creators in this process. And, is it completely hands off the wheel? Am I injecting myself at the tail end of the process, or is my value being put in at the beginning of that process? Augmentation of the sketch process is going to expand that ability to conceptualize ideas outside of what we may have thought of. Like I said, imagine a system where not only is it able to produce visual output based on adjectives, but we input a problem as a designer. Hey, I need a product that costs this much, that performs this function, and takes into consideration these maybe ergonomic factors, or it could be socioeconomic factors, whatever. And it starts spitting out ideas. It's going to be really interesting. Visual communication will become more accessible to more people. We're going to have to democratize our process, and be more inclusive of others, because again, much like the evolution of these tools that have been somewhat limited to people with high technical ability, when you lower the bar of technical aptitude that's necessary to communicate an idea, everyone can participate, right? Just like we teach writing in grade school and everyone learns how to write, and people can communicate, everyone's going to be able to communicate visually if they want to. So it will be imperative that we as creatives sharpen and hone those curation skills. Sharpen your eye, right? Saturate yourself with inspiration, collaborate with others, and make sure that you have those skills ready so that we can expand our creative offerings and still be relevant, still be valuable. Because the time is coming that there will be less need, like I said, for that high aptitude, technical skill to execute a drawing in a way that evokes emotion or encapsulates the idea in a compelling way. All right. So with that, I'm going to wrap. I think I have a blank slide there, but thank you. I think Daniela. I hope I'm ending at the right time. I just wanted to make sure. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Hey, Spencer, thank you so
Yes.
much. Yeah, we're a little bit over time, but it's totally fine. This was
Oh,
a
okay.
very, very interesting kind of like, and there were some comments about this that, nobody thought that talk about sketching could be so deep.
Oh, well, I mean, I've been doing it for, oh man, over 20 years now. So I sit, sometimes I think about these things. And like I said, the last 2 years have been really interesting in terms of how impressive these tools are, right? And you can look at it as a threat, or you can look at it as an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the most important thing that I take away from this is that it's really all about being able to express those. Like, I think there's two kind of like sides of it. One is being able to express those ideas that you have, but then also being able to problem solve and kind of like work with yourself and go through that kind of like creative process through the tools that you're using. So it's kind of like those two things that you use, like where you would use visual communication in a way to be able to kind of like go through your creative process. But I think the most important thing of it all is it's really all about communication. It's really all about like expressing that idea and like seeing where it lands and how far it can go.
Yeah, when I was younger, I used to get upset when people would like take a CAD model and then overlay it digitally. I'm like, you're not doing it the hard way. It's not as good. But really, like you said, Daniel, it's about just communicating the idea. It doesn't matter how you do it. It's still a sketch. It's still an unfinished thought. It's still a low cost, low effort activity in expressing the idea, and that's totally fine.
Cool. All right. So I want to make sure that we answer a few questions from the audience.
Okay.
So, acting in the role of a curator, do you envision the designer of the future having their own personal AI that learns the designer's style? Could this AI then be accessed worldwide for commissions like an extension of the designer?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thought. The the analog to that, I would say, is so deep fake technology, where you can study an actor's face, place them on a model, and take their likeness. Bruce Willis recently sold his likeness to a Russian company, I believe, who has been using him in commercials now because that's something you can do. So, could we as designers train our AI and then employ that AI? I think it's possible. It certainly moves into interesting ethical areas. If that AI is then creating content or creating stuff based on our style, do they have certain rights, or is it, there's just, I think it gets a little bit messy, but it's also interesting. Um, and to what extent is that AI going to be independent of us, or maybe it is just this dumb tool. I don't mean that as in terms of unintelligent, but this tool that we have in our toolbox, just like I always have markers with me.
All right. Now that you have finished publishing the book, have you considered attempting your famous 500 sketches a month challenge, integrating gravity sketch into it?
I have not. That would be intense. I'd probably have to do 500 in a year. It's probably what I'd have to do, but
Yeah.
um
Well, food for thought, Spencer. Food for thought. um. All right. There's one more. Let's read one more. At
okay.
school, they taught us how to visually communicate through a variety of tools, as you've mentioned. But which method is the more predominant currently in the industry? For example, are employers preferencing digital sketches over pen sketches?
I would say, hmm, I mean, I'm biased toward paper sketches, but yeah, digital sketches for sure. If you, I would say just pick an app, whether it's, hey, I sketch in Photoshop or Sketchbook Pro, Procreate, or Fresco, and they get really good at that. But just remember that the skills you learn in terms of visual communication can apply to different scenarios, which is why I kind of always come back to paper, like get good on paper so you can sketch elsewhere. But as far as what employers want or what you might show to a client, for example, or in a presentation, typically it would be a digital rendering or sketch.